We're officially live. I'd like to welcome everybody to this special talk with Tyler Haulotte. Is that how you say it?
Yeah.
Haulotte?
Haulotte.
Cool.
Yeah. Basically right. Yeah.
Sweet. Well, before launching in here, we're going to say a few words about who we are, what we're doing, what this is, and who you are. Of course, I'll let you say a little bit more about yourself, but I'll say the basic gist of it. So I guess today's interesting because this is the first time that we're showing up on anybody's anything as the Cascadia Network, because I changed the account name on our Google. We haven't changed any of our names elsewhere, but that is the brand shift we're going for. We're changing from the Turtle Island Research Cooperative to the Cascadia Network. And basically what that is, and what the center at Victory Farm here is a nonprofit organization that researches, develops, and promotes monastic-inspired living, learning communities. And the center here at Victory Farm in Boise, Idaho, is primarily focused on the humanities, poetry, literature, and philosophy. So when Michael Downs, one of our good friends, told us about Tyler's, I guess he said that when it comes to German idealism, the one person you want to talk to is Tyler. He gave this amazing lecture in one of our discussion groups a while back. And so we reached out and got a hold of Tyler. I think Tyler joined us for something previously. Is that right?
Yeah.
Right. Wait. That was actually really hard to hear. I think we need to turn you up, though. Okay. What was that?
Oh, sorry. I said, yeah, I was lucky enough to be able to join you guys whenever you guys talked to Arthur Bradley.
Oh, yeah. That's right. And so let's see, you're a graduate student at Purdue, and you are focusing on pretty much German idealism, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, and especially, and then as far as more recent people, you focus a lot on Derrida, but it's kind of all I know, and so I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, no, that's right. I particularly, as far as the German Idealist tradition is concerned, I work more with Fichte and Hegel. But yeah, that's totally my interest. It's what I'm into. So I was really happy to be able to hear Arthur Bradley talk. So yeah, as far as this is concerned, Michael sort of set me up for failure, oh, it's going to be great. But sort of what I anticipate trying to do is just, I heard that you guys are working through some Kant texts right now, and that you plan in the future on doing some work on Hegel. And so as someone who, is sort of in the thick of it as far as getting through a lot of this literature and having, sort of trespassed this stuff fairly recently, I'm not sort of covered, I guess, with the historical rust that a lot of professors that have been doing this for 20 years. I know what it's like to encounter this stuff for the first time still. And so what I intend to do is basically just try to illuminate what are sort of the central problems of German idealism, what is sort of helpful in terms of approaching it as you guys are doing, and what are some maybe traps to fall into, how can you avoid them. And so I intend this to be sort of just like tips and tricks sort of deal, sort of explain maybe the general trajectory of German idealism, general, maybe broad overview of Kant, what Kant is sort of up to, and then explaining some skeptical responses to Kant. And then, depending on how much time we have, maybe briefly going over the general strategy of response by some of the post-Kantian German idealists.
Awesome. Good. And I did want to say that we have a couple other people here in Boise who are also reading the Kant's First Critique. And so Brian and I right here, we're doing it on our own. and then we know 2 other people who are doing it also, and we might. I mean, this is just kind of like a first run through it, kind of with the intention of coming back for a deeper read sometime in the future. But also, like, this first run is preparation, like you said, for Hegel's Phenomenology of the Spirit, probably this summer. So.
Yeah, I feel like no matter how many times you read the first critique, it's always sort of a broad run through, and you're like, oh, I'll really nail this stuff later. For now, let me get some real sense of what's going on. And yeah, I don't know if you ever get to that point where you actually nail it. Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, that's sort of, yeah. So yeah, do we need to wait on anybody else, or should we get started? Or
those others aren't able to join in the flesh, so they'll be watching the recorded version of this because this will be up on our channel.
Okay, cool. So yeah, so like I said, a general sort of outline. I'll give some sort of tips for dealing with the German Idealist tradition in general, sort of my own strategies, and then giving maybe sort of a broad overview of Kant that'll probably start out kind of easy and then get into some more technical stuff towards the end. And then, like I said, get into the sort of post-Kantian responses. But one thing that I think I should say initially is just that the German idealist tradition is incredibly complex. It's very rich and super intimidating to people. In some ways, rightly so. Like, it's really hard. But I think that the reason why it's so difficult is often overlooked. Namely, there's sort of an explosion of philosophy that happens after the publication of the Critique of Pure Reason in 1781. And so even though it's a very, very short amount of time from the Critique of Pure Reason to the Phenomenology of Spirit, it's like basically 25 years, depending on if you count the publication of the Phenomenology in 1807 or 1806, when it was written. But in any case, it's only 25, 26 years, which, in philosophy is not a very long time. And sort of the amount of terrain that's gone over between Kant and Hegel is quite a lot. There's sort of almost an entire genre of books that are just sort of Kant to Hegel sort of books. And so this is kind of a problem because in traditional philosophy classrooms, normally this period is covered as if it were a period like any other. And you'll maybe read some Kant and then you'll read some Hegel and you're like, that was hard, wasn't it? Now we can get our breath of fresh air with Marx or Nietzsche or whoever. And, then you're sort of done with it. But the problem is that because it's just such an incredibly condensed and compact period, it can be very difficult to follow if you're not following the very minute sort of historical details, moving from Kant to his immediate post-Kantian responses and sort of skeptics and stuff like that. And so generally, I would sort of recommend for anyone that's trying to tackle stuff in the German idealist tradition, be a little bit more patient than you otherwise might be with some other philosophical traditions. I mean, part of it is just how explosive the Critique of Pure Reason was as a text. The Critique of Pure Reason was seen as sort of just a complete overturning of the entire methodology of philosophy in its time. And so obviously this provokes a series of reactions. You'll read like Fichte and Hegel complaining constantly that now everyone has their own system. That because Kant was able to sort of give this breath of fresh air into philosophy, that it sort of expands incredibly quickly as a result. And so you have to sort of be really patient and careful with all the historical details and tracking who's responding to what sort of problem. And that's, I think, ultimately the reason why a lot of German idealist stuff is really opaque. That, and after Hegel, we basically, as a Western philosophical tradition, not necessarily abandon the project, but we minimally abandon a lot of the jargon and terminology used in the project. And so without sort of that foundation, you sort of come back to someone like Hegel and you flip open to a random page of the Science of Logic. It's like essence is the essencing of the essence itself, or something like that. And you're just like, why would anyone read this? You know? And that's a reasonable reaction to have in some respects, but more productive would be sort of reading, why is it that Hegel feels the need to have this sort of crazy language in the doctrine of essence, stuff like that. I think another thing that is really helpful, by the way, you guys can interject at any point if something I say is unclear or anything like that. But another thing that I think is helpful for getting a handle of the German idealist tradition in general is that there's a sort of tendency in both the analytic and the continental tradition to sort of read the German idealist tradition as, oh, for like 20 years or so, everyone went crazy and wanted to put everything that was outside of your head inside of your head. And that's clearly wrong. So, you know, then we move on to the good, nice materialisms of Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, and, you know, whoever else, or maybe the Vienna School. But I sort of follow Friedrich Beiser. He has a really good book called German Idealism, The Struggle Against Subjectivism, which I think that a lot of people would sort of be surprised by, right? Like, isn't Hegel finally the absolute idealist? Hegel's finally the person where everything is ideal or something like that. But I think Beiser is very convincing in arguing that actually the German idealist tradition is a series of responses to skeptical problems. And in particular, it's trying to avoid a sort of empirical or naive kind of subjectivism that is particularly a problem Kant thinks in empiricism, and in particular Humean empiricism. And we'll talk a little bit more about that right before we get into the first critique, and sort of the broad overview of the first critique. So I think that keeping that in mind, and keeping in mind how each of the German idealists, despite the appearance that it's just sort of metaphysics gone wild or something like that, they're all responding to very particular skeptical problems. And your ability to isolate the skeptical problems that they're responding to will make your ability to understand sort of the nature of their solution and why it's sort of not crazy speculative metaphysics, or at least not a naive form of crazy speculative metaphysics, is in general really helpful. So I think that those are sort of two general points about the German idealist tradition. It's helpful for reading them in general. I wrote down some recommendations for secondary literature if you guys were at all interested in that. You want me to go into that, or would that not be helpful?
Sure, I'm okay. So you can talk a little bit about it, but also, like, if you can share that list after.
Yeah, I can do that.
Share it to the Facebook event itself. That way everyone who came in can get it, but then I'll share it into the YouTube description.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, I'll just write this out at the end then.
So the struggle against subjectivism was by who again?
That was by Friedrich Beiser. Wrote the name into the chat log, and this will be sort of it, you know, in the recommendations that I have. It's a really big book. It's like 700 pages long, but it's really worth reading. It's very good. And it's also sort of one of those books that covers such a long historical period that if you really wanted to, you could kind of treat it like an encyclopedia and just read the sections that are relevant to you at that moment. I mean, in general, it'd be obviously better if you sort of read it linearly, but you can still sort of use it for that purpose. So it's really helpful, I think, as sort of getting your bearings for dealing with it. So yeah, we'll do that sort of secondary stuff that I think is more helpful towards the end. So yeah. So in that case, I think that probably since all of the German idealists post-Kantian German idealists are responding to specific skeptical problems with Kant, it would be helpful to sort of motivate, okay, why does everyone care that much about Kant? Like, why is Kant sort of this turning point for philosophy? What is it about the first critique that sort of obsesses all of the German idealists who come afterwards? And, you know, why is this not merely sort of a historical problem? Why is this a problem that's still sort of alive today? And so one thing that's sort of commonplace in discussing Kant, but is a commonplace because it's true, is that Kant saw himself and was responding to Humean skeptical problems about causality. He's really clear about this in the Prolegomena, but it's also pretty apparent in how Kant decided to write the first critique. So in general, the Humean problem about causality says that, look, things are either relations of ideas, or they're given in experience. Causality can't be something that's just a relation of ideas because effects are different from their causes. So they can't just be analytically contained within the concept. So that explanation for causality is out. But then also, causality is not something that you can directly experience within the world. And so that explanation's out too. And so Hume thinks that those are the only two plausible epistemological ways of accessing causal concepts. And since neither of them can coherently explain the necessity of causal relationships, Hume thinks that it's just sort of a subjective convention. It's just habit. You just associate two phenomena regularly, and that's all that causality ultimately is. And so causality is not something which is sort of secured a priori, independent of experience, but is instead just sort of a subjective habit on account of the person who experiences them regularly. And so this is sort of the general subjectivism problem that Kant is responding to. Kant wants to say the obvious thing, which is that causal relationships are not subjective. It's not just because I see, you know, two billiard balls, knocking into one another, and I associate those representations that one moves the other, or one causes the other. No, it's because those billiard balls are really structured that way. Causality is a real feature of the world. And moreover, not only does this apply to causality, but basically every structure that is independent of experience and prior to experience is going to work this way. So mathematics and geometry, Kant thinks, are further examples of this sort of relationship that Hume has to make totally new. Either these relationships give no knowledge whatsoever, and they're mere relations of ideas, which is not very satisfying because it seems like mathematics is a real kind of knowledge, as is geometry. Or you say that they're just sort of mere habits. They're just empirically given. But this doesn't really seem like a satisfying explanation either, because that's not how mathematical concepts work. I don't need to know empirically that 1,000,000 plus 1 is going to be 1,000,001, 1,000,000 and plus another 1 is going to be 1,000,002, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so this sort of empirical account of how mathematics and geometry work isn't satisfying either. And so in general, the problem that Kant is responding to is the subjectivism that's caused by empiricist notions of causality. But Kant thinks that this problem that Hume isolates with causality in particular goes well beyond mere causal relationships into basically all sorts of structures that we need for experience and science to work at all. And so Kant is very, very worried about this, and rightfully so. And this is sort of the motivating feature behind a lot of the first critique, is that we have, for instance, Newtonian mechanics, and that seems to work. But empiricist accounts don't seem to offer an adequate explanation for how they work. And rationalist accounts don't give a sort of epistemological basis for how those accounts work at all. And so Kant thinks that current knowledge is sort of almost in this quasi-Cartesian position, right? Cartesian in the sense that it seems like we have a whole lot of empirical knowledge that is reliable even, like Newtonian physics, mathematics, but we don't have a secure foundation for how we get this kind of knowledge or how this kind of knowledge works. And so Kant's project in the first critique is to offer a kind of tribunal for reason, to sort of reassess, just as Descartes did in the Meditations, where exactly things have gone right and where things have gone wrong. What is the secure foundation of our knowledge? How can we know what the secure foundation for our knowledge actually is? And so Kant is this really, I think, pivotal point in the history of modern philosophy, because it's kind of a moment where modern philosophy sort of takes stock of, you know, what's taken place within the last few centuries. What is sort of the outcome of all these debates between rationalism and empiricism? What is it that we can know, and how is it that we can know it? In a lot of Kantian divisions, like between sensibility and the understanding, sensibility being receptive faculty for things that we experience, and understanding being associated with concepts and rules. And we'll talk more about this distinction and why Kant feels the need to make it. That seems to, Kant thinks at least, sort of synthesize the best aspects of empiricism and its sort of healthy dose of skepticism that he thinks that, for instance, Hume has, without sort of going overboard and getting rid of all these rational structures that are not only important for math and science, but also important for making sense of experience at all. And so that's sort of the general project behind the first critique and the skeptical problem that Kant's responding to. And so while Kant does in some ways come to a kind of subjectivist, and in particular sort of what sense you mean by subjectivist position, that sort of arises out of a response to what he sees as a more radical and dangerous kind of subjectivism that is sort of the Humean or Berkeleyan position about empirical things. So the way that a lot of Kant scholars will talk about this is that Kant becomes a transcendental idealist in order to save empirical realism. That is to say, Kant constructs this position, transcendental idealism, and we'll fill in more what exactly that means, in order to make sense of our actual real experience. Unlike someone like Berkeley, he's not going to say that our experience is all fundamentally an illusion, or that certain kinds of properties are necessarily illusory, or that we can't make sense of natural causal laws or something like that. Kant thinks all this stuff is necessary for the world as you see it to make sense, and for that to be sort of realistic, a kind of realism. And so this is why I think that a lot of contemporary continental scholarship on Kant sort of misses the mark. This is sort of the Méliès criticism, if you guys know that or are interested, that Kant is a correlationist. This is sort of a criticism that he's like too subjectivist. He's too focused on individual subjects and stuff like that, which maybe as a criticism is ultimately true, but it's sort of missing the ultimate motivation behind the Kantian project, which is to avoid this subjectivism about empirical stuff, namely appearances. Kant wants to save the reality, the objectivity of appearances, and that's what motivates his transcendental idealist position. And so even Kant, who takes up the title of a transcendental idealist, even him, who is very clear that we're dealing with appearances and not things in themselves, he does this not to sort of muddy the waters and make everything more subjective than it was previously, but instead to be able to save the objective reality that's sort of necessary for natural science and to make sense of our experiences as we have them. And so that's sort of the basic fundamental motivation behind the critique of pure reason, as I understand it, and as well as sort of the skeptical problem that Kant sees himself as responding to. And this is one reason why I think that the German idealist tradition, even beginning with Kant, who is arguably the most subjectivist, is still sort of an attempt to respond to a sort of kind of subjectivism. So yeah, are there any questions up to this point?
No, it's very clear.
Okay, cool. So I guess now that we've sort of outlined the problem, the general motivations behind Kant's project, the sort of next step would be to, okay, well, what is the actual solution and how does he resolve the sort of empirical skepticism, subjectivism of Hume and other sorts of empiricists? So we explained the Humean problem was that you had a choice between relations of ideas. These are totally a priori, and they're based in Leibnizian concept containment. And so the idea of a lot of the early rationalists was that if you gave sufficiently precise, clear, and distinct, something like that, first principle, then you could proceed analytically, that is, just by looking at that concept and arrive at basically all of the necessary metaphysical knowledge. And so I think that sort of a prime candidate for viewing things this way would be Spinoza. That Spinoza sort of gives you in the ethics, like Proposition 1, I think it is, this is what substance is. And then more or less, Spinoza thinks, just adequately think through this concept of substance, then you get all the rest of the stuff in the ethics. Arguably, similar things happen with Descartes and the Meditations. If you just think through the cogito, then you sort of, all the rest of the stuff in the meditation sort of flows from there. And so Kant will refer to these as sort of analytic judgments. Analytic just means, you know, it's like analysis, like you're just taking apart various aspects of that concept. So, for instance, for Spinoza, you can just take apart from substance that it's a cause of itself. That's not something additional that you're adding to substance. You're just further clarifying what you mean by substance. And so analytic judgments don't add anything. They're just analysis. It's just taking apart what's already contained within a given concept. So the other option that Hume gives us is experience, which is synthetic. So experience is synthetic because you're adding something, right? Whenever you understand causal relationships, you understand more than the cause. The effect isn't contained within the cause at all. Otherwise, it wouldn't be an effect. It wouldn't be something that is sufficiently distinct from its cause. And so Hume thinks that all of these sort of synthetic judgments or ways that you can get synthetic knowledge arise from experience. And so the sort of general form of Kant's solution is to ask the question, how are synthetic a priori concepts possible? And so that is like, you know, a real turning point in the history of philosophy. In general, what he means is, how can we arrive at a way of getting knowledge that's not based on experience? Because if it's totally based on experience, you get the subjectivist problems that Hume ran into. But it's also synthetic, because if it were just analytic, then you aren't gaining any knowledge. There's nothing to be gained by endlessly discussing concepts and what are contained within those concepts. And so Kant wants to arrive at a genuinely new foundation of knowledge that is what he calls the synthetic a priori. So some grounds that is independent of experience, but that nevertheless is actually informative of the way that you experience things. That is actually informative of your own experience. And so, a different way of framing this, if sort of the jargon of synthetic a priori judgment is like maybe a little bit too much, is to say that sort of what is the more than empirical framework which makes empirical judgments possible. So like, for instance, taking the Humean position, what is it that lets us make the associations that are necessary for regularity to occur at all? Because if you don't have an account of this, then you haven't really given an account of causality even on the Humean picture. There's no account given in Hume for the basis of the purported subject that is associating things and how that subject is going about doing them. And so Kant wants to give this framework that lets our sort of empirical concepts like association and causal relationships, what is the necessary a priori framework to make all that stuff work? And so that's sort of why Kant is so interested, why he sets up the Critique and especially the Prolegomena, which he thought was sort of a propedeutic way of getting into, a way of understanding the critique of theories. And that's why he's so concerned with the question of how are synthetic a priori judgments possible. Because he thinks that it's a genuinely new foundation for knowledge that's not at all contained within any sort of the previous philosophers. And so, moreover, we not only need to just sort of rely on this framework, which he says implicitly we have been relying on up to this point, because we have been making synthetic judgments, but we've been sort of making them very haphazardly. He sort of compares it, I think, in the A preface, to sort of groping in the dark. That we have this sort of framework that makes our knowledge possible, but we haven't really investigated that framework itself or understood how that framework works at all. And so the first critique is going to be an attempt to understand that framework and how it works such that we can be sure about, maybe not about specific causal judgments, but that causality itself is like a coherent structure, that we can talk about causal relationships objectively and not just have a sort of subjective necessity, which is the way that Hume phrases the association by habit. And so Kant sort of divvies up the faculties of our knowledge. And so so this word faculties comes up a lot in Kant, and it's going to be sort of a problem for the later post-Kantian German idealists, because they'll have a lot of questions that are like, what is a faculty? How do we know that we have these faculties? What would it mean? What does it mean to say that we have this many and not, so many more? And what is sort of the grounds of that knowledge? But Kant, at this point, seems to rely on previous philosophical frameworks. Like if you read, for instance, almost all of modern philosophy will talk about the relationship between the sensibility and the understanding, and nonetheless have like a completely divergent understandings of these terms and their relationships. And so Kant sort of takes on this vocabulary, I think, in part to be accessible to sort of the history of modern philosophy. And in general, Kant wants to divvy up the faculties such that there are receptive faculties and there are spontaneous faculties, which is another way of sort of divvying up the grounds between sort of rational solutions and empiricist solutions. So, so the receptive faculty is sensibility and intuition, and he wants to figure out sort of how is it that we receive experience. He says experience is sort of the foundation of all of our knowledge. So how is that the case? What are the conditions of this experience, as we talked about previously with Hume? And then more than just experiential knowledge, we also have a sort of spontaneous activity where we categorize and organize this experience under concepts. And that's going to be sort of divvied up into the faculty of the understanding. There's one line in the Critique of Pure Reason where Kant says something like, oh, we get these two sort of fundamental faculties, and if they come from the same roots, then we don't know what it is, but maybe they do. That's going to be like a huge problem for post-Kantian German idealists, because they're going to be very interested in what is the fundamental unity between this apparently receptive faculty over on this side and this spontaneous faculty over on the other side, and how do they relate, basically. And so just like incredibly briefly, here's sort of, I guess, an outline of what Kant attempts to do in the first critique, and why he offers something like a solution. So in the Transcendental Aesthetic, here Kant tries to figure out what are the basis for synthetic a priori judgments that relate to our sensibility, our intuition. And so Kant thinks that we don't just sort of have sensations sort of haphazardly, right? In here, if you wanted to get more into the details, he's sort of in the middle of a dispute between Leibniz and Newton. So Newton thought that space was absolute, and Leibniz thought that space and time were just absolutely relational. And so the Leibnizian account wanted to say something like, oh, hey, you see one thing, and you see another thing, and then, through some mental activity, you're like, oh, there's a space in between those two things, completely relative to you. Whereas Newton wanted to think of space and time as sort of like a big container that everything was just sort of in. But the problem was that both of these sort of led to indissoluble problems. And so the basis of Kant's solution is to say that space and time are forms of our intuition. And so what he means by that is that space and time are the sort of filter or way in which we can receive any sensible information at all. And so there are, so space and time serve to structure and order our receptive capacities such that anything can show up to us, has to show up within a space and within a time. So we can think of an empty space and we can think of an empty time, but it's not possible for us, Kant says, to imagine anything like, an object appearing to us, but outside of the constraints of space and time. This is sort of the general move. And so he wants to say space and time aren't just sort of contingent features about the world, nor are they just something that you kind of make up, but instead they're a necessary constitutive structure for any object to appear to you at all. So for there to be anything that appears to you, for you to have any sensation whatsoever, that sensation needs to be ordered, Kant says, according to what he a priori framework of space and time that can serve to sort of filter your sensation. Filter is almost not quite right, because filter almost seems to imply that you could like take off the filter or something like that. But importantly for Kant, these are constitutive, which means that you don't get any objects at all. There's nothing that you can receive. There's no sensation outside of space and time. And so Kant thinks that so our judgments, what we think are actually genuinely synthetic a priori judgments. And here he gives the example of arithmetic and geometry. So 5 plus 7 equals 12. Kant thinks that implicitly, this relies on an inner sense of time. That's sort of the basis for arithmetic and why arithmetic is synthetic rather than analytic. Why it is that pure mathematics actually gives you genuine knowledge rather than you're just sort of pushing symbols around or something like that. Similarly with geometry. Kant's example in geometry is that a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. This is sort of a geometric idea, proposition. Kant thinks it's genuinely synthetic because you don't get that kind of knowledge by just examining the concept of point or line or anything like that. You have to actually sort of mentally chart out this information into space for you to acquire that kind of knowledge. And so Kant, at this point, thinks he's doing pretty good, right? Like he's discovered sort of an a priori basis for our understanding of arithmetic and geometry, which were two examples of synthetic a priori judgments that we really needed to have, in his view, for us to have genuine kinds of knowledge. And so that's a very, very broad outline of what Kant is up to in the transcendental aesthetic. So at this point, Kant thinks that he's given us at least some necessary basis for some of these synthetic a priori judgments, but there are other synthetic a priori judgments, namely ones that relate to causality. He hasn't really solved this problem yet. Just saying that causal relationships happen in space and in time doesn't tell us anything about why those judgments are necessary at all. And so at this point, Kant engages in what is arguably maybe the hardest chapter of anything in the history of philosophy, which is the Transcendental Deduction.
Seriously, that's what we just read through like last week and this week. It's pretty rough.
It's hard. It's like maybe the hardest single text in the history of philosophy. Really hard. If it's helpful, a guy named Henry Allison he writes really good books on Kant. And they're very, very helpful. And I think that he wrote one specifically just on the Transcendental Deduction. I haven't read it myself, but I've heard from a lot of people that it's very helpful. Another thing is that there are very minute and difficult differences between the A version and the B version of the Transcendental Deduction. And people, if you meet Kant scholars, this is like a lot of their bread and butter is they are sort of going through these two different versions. Brief overview of what the A version and the B version are. So the A version of the critique is the one he publishes in 1781. He publishes this after 10 years of silence. He's pretty happy with it. And then these reviews come out that basically say that he's a Berkeleyan idealist and a mystic. These things in themselves are the cause of all of our representations and we can never know them. And he's sort of portrayed both as a subjectivist and a mystic. And he really doesn't like this. He's not happy at all. And so he publishes the Prolegomena, which he intends to sort of help show why what he's up to is not some weird kind of mysticism or subjectivism. Because the whole point of the Prolegomena is just we have natural science. How is natural science possible? And particularly the B version of the critique adds a whole bunch of stuff that is usually aimed at, here's why I'm not an idealist like you guys think I'm an idealist. And so he adds stuff like the refutation of idealism, and he kind of scraps the A version of the deduction and gives the B version. Importantly, almost all of the post-Kantian, to my knowledge, all of the post-Kantian German idealists, they all had the B version. Because after the B version becomes published in, I think, 1787, the A version is just not available for a very long time. And so some Kant scholars will say that this is a really big deal. If you read like Heidegger talking about the critique of pure reason, he thinks it's a really big deal. His sort of way of doing battle with Hegel is to try to use the A version of Kant against Hegel and the other German idealists. So basically, a lot of people cut their teeth over over this kind of stuff, which is maybe helpful to know and why it might seem. Hopefully that maybe illuminates some of the motivations behind differences in the A and the B version, if you're paying attention to it at all. The first time I read the critique, I didn't at all, because I had none of the background to know. Like, they were just kind of funny letters on the side. I didn't really understand at all. But yeah, that's sort of what's going on there. But the general project of the Transcendental Deduction. Okay, so Kant has established at this point that there are a priori forms of our intuition based in Kant. And that's well and good. And those are objectively necessary, which is to say they apply to all the objects because they're constitutive of what it means to be an object at all, because they're receptive, right? You don't get any objects without them. Well and good. The deduction offers a much more difficult problem for Kant. Why? Because now we're not dealing with a receptive faculty, we're dealing with a spontaneous one. And so basically the worry is that, okay, Kant, you've given us all these categories that you say are objectively necessary, but aren't they just sort of these human categories that we go and we apply to things, and they're basically illegitimate? And this is sort of the thrust of Hume's criticism. It is the thrust of Hume's response to the problem of causality, right? Is that causality is basically just a human category. It's not something that belongs to those objects. It's not something objectively necessary. And so what Kant is going to try to do with the transcendental deduction is to say, actually, there are necessary concepts that we, as subjects, apply to any and everything that we sense, and these categories are objectively necessary, which is to say that you don't get any objects without them. They're constitutive of what it means to be an object. So I don't think it would be totally necessary or incredibly productive to go into the line by line, nor probably am I capable of going into a direct line by line of the transcendental deduction. But the general strategy is that Kant wants to say that, look, all the experiences that you could have, the ability to have sensations, the ability for any object to show up to you at all, requires that there is one unified subject that is experiencing all those things throughout. Moreover, these can't just be radically heterogeneous experiences. They have to be connected, structured, coherent in a particular way, because otherwise there's no basis for the association of any one representation with any other representation. So, like we mentioned with the Hume problem, Hume said that things, that we associate representations together, and that's what gives us causality, causal structures, but that's not enough. Because Hume, number one, denies that there's anything like a coherent unified subject. And so what is it that's doing this experience? In what ways are those experiences connected, related? How do you account for their regularity with one another, especially when your entire account of causality is based on regularity? And moreover, how is it that one representation can ever be linked to any other one? How is it you get any sort of unified conception of experience at all? This is sort of the basis of what the Transcendental Deduction is trying to do. What the Transcendental Deduction tries to say is that, hey, in order to have anything like a coherent, unified experience whatsoever, then you need all 12 of these categories. And these categories offer sort of the way in which I, as a subject, go and relate objects to one another. And they wouldn't be objects at all if I couldn't talk about them in these sorts of relationships. And so, in a lot of ways, the entire coherence of the Kantian project totally rests on whether or not you think the transcendental deduction is sort of a valid argument or not, whether or not that in general works. But this moment is what gets all the post-Kantian German idealists really excited. That they are sort of astounded that we can give a basis, a ground, an a priori ground even, for the very fact that we have experiences, that they are regular, and that we are a unified subject that relates them. And not only is this the case, but that we do this spontaneously, that it's us who does the unifying. Importantly, Kant, whenever he talks about intuition, he says that he always talks about manifolds of intuition. Intuitions are not at all unified. They're just sort of sense experience. It's not until we get a concept in the understanding that we come to unify the sense experience in a very particular way. So, like, you know, you can think about this in terms of problems in the history of modern philosophy about substance and their properties. So I feel brown, I feel hard, I feel, or see maybe square, I see these things are next to one another. What is the basis for me saying this is a table? What is the basis for me putting all those divergent properties together in one single spot and being able to make anything like a judgment in the sort of judgments that we make all the time that make experience possible? Because if experience wasn't filled with anything like an object, experience wasn't about anything, then you couldn't even coherently talk about experience at all. This is sort of the basis of what Kant is up to in the Transcendental Deduction, as I understand it. So yeah, at this point, you know, he's supposed to go, ta-da, like, I did it, you know, I offered sort of the synthetic a priori basis. I've eliminated all the skepticism that you could have about causality and all the stuff that we need to structure our experience. We have a coherent understanding of our experience, but, and here becomes the huge but, it's not about things in themselves. So it's not about objects outside of how I could ever register them, how I could sense them, how I could apply concepts to them, but they're about my experiences. They're about appearances and not about things in themselves. And that the problem with all the rest of the history of philosophy up to this point is they thought that you could talk about things if they were entirely unrelated to you. But part of what the Transcendental Deduction tries to show is that that's incoherent. You can't talk about objects at all outside of relationships that you apply to them. And so you can't get any genuine knowledge out of things in themselves. And so this is sort of the bitter taste of what Transcendental Idealism is like. And maybe to fill in that gap that we left earlier, Transcendental Idealism is just to say that any transcendent object, anything in itself, is ideal. It's like something that we have to posit, but not anything that we have any access to. And so Kant is an empirical realist in that experiences are coherent, they're necessary, they're unified. We can talk about them objectively, but things in themselves, things apart from our sensory apparatus, things radically heterogeneous to our sensory apparatus, and things that we could never apply concepts to, we can't talk about it at all. And so the second half of the Critique of Pure Reason, the Transcendental Dialectic, what this is sort of all about is about figuring out what are these objects that we thought we could talk about, these things in themselves, but it turns out that we actually can't. And so Kant here will talk about the faculty of reason. And what's really interesting about Kant's account, what's sort of uniquely transcendental, people will talk about transcendental as just referring to conditions of possibility for, which is a coherent meaning of what transcendental means. But sort of what's unique to Kant is that Kant thinks that human faculties go wrong all on their own. That it's not some mistake that you're making, that it's a necessary feature of your reason that you apply these categories as if they were the things in themselves. But that it's easy for this illusion, which is necessary, there's a necessary illusion, to become deception whenever they're applied beyond their legitimate capacity. And so Kant's part of what I think is really motivating for all the post-Kantian German idealists and what makes the Critique of Pure Reason such a compelling book for everyone is that it sets out all of this really difficult, potentially dubious stuff in the Transcendental Analytic, where he's like, here's how all the faculties work, and here's how synthetic a priori judgments are possible. And then the Transcendental Dialectic goes through almost every major philosophical problem in the history of philosophy and shows how they're all based on deception. They're all based on a misapplication of your categories to something it can't apply to.
Cool.
And so, yeah, it's really cool, right? It's like you solve all the problems in the history of philosophy, done. You solved them all, right? You got back science, you got back math, you got everything basically that you wanted. But the huge but is that now, unfortunately, you can't say anything about things in themselves. You can't say anything about how stuff is outside of your sensory apparatus. You can't say anything about what things are like outside of your application of concepts to them. And you just have to live with that. He, as he said in the critique, he's limiting knowledge to make room for faith. And so a lot of philosophical problems and stuff you might want to know about, like freedom and God, the soul, those are ultimately practical ideas, and you have to have faith, and he'll demonstrate some practical reasons for why you should, but they're not theoretically demonstrable in any way. And so that's how the Critique of Pure Reason sort of ends, is sort of on this note of like, kind of very moderate, it's advising you to moderation. That, hey, we have these faculties, they work great, and here's how they work, and I've provided a solid systematically. Here's how you can screw it up in all the millions of ways the history of philosophy is done up to this point. So, kind of there you go. And Kant seems to hope that this is going to inspire, like, basically the entire history of philosophy afterwards. It's just going to be sort of tinkering with figuring out more explicitly what he's worked out in this. And so that's Kant's general problem in the Critique of Pure Reason. And that's sort of why he's responding to a skeptical problem. And that's the general form of the solution that he offered. Sorry if I've been talking for too long, but it's like really hard, and I'm still simplifying a whole lot what Kant is up to. But that's sort of, if anything, the general form of what he is up to in the first critique, and why that's maybe compelling, and why it's a response to skeptical problems. So I think that maybe I could answer any questions you guys might have up to this point, and then we can move on to their skeptical responses to the critique. So what are the problems with the solution that Kant has offered? So do you guys have any questions or anything like that?
I'll ask one. It's about the title of the talk. It's Kantian Antinomies and German Idealism. What are antinomies, and have you already covered those?
Good. You're right. No, I haven't. So in the Transcendental Deduction, he goes over antinomies of pure reason. And here's what he means by this. He means these are the problems that reason necessarily runs into whenever it tries to think about things in themselves. And so he offers 4 different kind of examples. He thinks that there are 4 sort of maybe primary cases where reason tries to think about things themselves, and then it runs into irresolvable dilemmas. And this sort of irresolvable dilemma category is what Kant means by an antinomy. It just sort of belongs to the structure of reason. You think one thing, and then you think the other thing, and you're not able to figure it out. And that's sort of why the history of philosophy is filled with all these interminable disagreements. So yeah, good, thank you. Yeah, I should have maybe gone over that in a little bit more depth. But so this is a particularly important moment for Kant, because this is like one of those instances where Kant's like, aha, I've solved all the history of philosophy. I solved everything about God, the world, the soul, whatever you would want to know. And solves all these sort of cosmological problems. But the title of the talk is supposed to sort of indicate not only antinomies in the Kantian sense, not only the stuff that Kant points out, but also in, I guess, sort of the next and last section, talk about what are the skeptical problems generated by the first critique? What are the antinomies of the Kantian position itself? And then that's sort of to prepare the way for the post-Kantian German idealist response afterwards. So like one thing that's really interesting is that one of Hegel's criticisms of Kant, and there are a lot of them, but one of them is that Kant thought that there were only 4 major antinomies. Hegel says that everything is antinomial, that irresolvable dilemmas are just part of the fabric of the world, which like is really crazy, and sort of leads him to all this sort of discussion about the negative and contradiction, and a lot of stuff that maybe a good Kantian would think is crazy metaphysics, that Hegel thinks is just sort of the necessary effect or outcome of taking Kant really seriously. So no, thanks. That was good. That was helpful. I should have talked about that more. Any other questions? Or move on to the next section.
Brian said you already answered his questions.
Oh, okay. Well, okay. Well, so why don't we just talk a little bit about the post-Kantian skeptical response to Kant. So after Kant wrote the first critique, like I mentioned, the immediate response was, okay, well, you say that there are these things in themselves, but what are those, and what are you talking about? Kant talks about them as a limit concept, but like, is that really coherent? It seems really mystical, because Kant at various points will say things like things in themselves cause our representation. Because presumably, right, our experiences aren't just, like, they don't just happen haphazardly. Like, they actually have a cause. And in fact, Kant thinks that you have to think this, because it's part of the categories that for everything you have to posit a cause for that thing. And so basically just group all of our experiences together. Those have to have a cause too. And so what is that cause? Kant says, oh, it's probably things themselves. But is that really coherent? Does that make sense? Because Kant's whole point in the Transcendental Deduction is to say that you can't apply the categories beyond mere appearances. But here it seems like, on the one hand, he has to, because he has to give an adequate account of how we have experiences at all, but he can't at the same time, because this violates the strict limits of what he set up as being the limitations for the applications of the categories. Namely, they can't apply to things themselves. And so one post-Kantian critic of Kant, this guy named Jacobi, what he says about things in themselves is, he says, and I'm paraphrasing here, he says something like, well, without things in themselves, I can't get into the Kantian system, but with things in themselves, I can't remain within the Kantian system. And so what he means by that is that if I don't posit things in themselves at all, then the Kantian restriction to only talking about appearances and not things in themselves isn't coherent. And that doesn't make sense. That contradicts the entire account of the first critique, because the thrust of the whole critique is that I need to be talking about appearances and not things in themselves. So that's why you need things in themselves. That's why you need things in themselves. But on the other hand, in order to talk about things in themselves, even as a limit concept, you have to be talking about how things in themselves are the cause of our experiences. And so you've already violated the Kantian dictum on your own knowledge. And so this is an instance of sort of what the title refers to as a Kantian antinomy, namely that it seems like an irresolvable contradiction in Kant's account. On the one hand, you need things in themselves, and you need things in themselves to cause our experiences. But on the other hand, the Transcendental Deduction says precisely you can't say that. So this is one of the immediate problems pointed out in the sort of post-Kantian skeptical response to Kant. And Kant is a major issue. Like, a lot of people think this is really compelling. Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, they all basically think that Jacobi is right about this. That the thing in itself is kind of a pre-Kantian hangover. But, you know, it's just as necessary to Kant's system as it is seemingly a violation of Kant's own system. So this is sort of one problem that is there immediately. Another problem pointed out by this guy named Schulze in the Antinomies review. He says that one of the objects of the antinomies was human freedom. So basically the antinomy runs something like this. He says, okay, on the one hand, in order for causal laws to work out, causality works uniformly and it works in one direction. And so the ability for something spontaneously to act in nature seems incoherent. And so you should just be a determinist. That's one side of the antinomy. The other side of the antinomy is that we are beings with awareness, that causality can't be uniformly run in one direction and be totally linear, because unlike other things in the cosmos, like rocks or something like that, it belongs to our nature to be aware of things that happen. That we're sort of free beings, and that's sort of necessary postulate for Kant's system. And so, you know, Kant's sort of typical solution, his transcendental ideal solution, is like, okay, well, irresolvable dispute because we're trying to talk about human freedom. And that's a thing in itself, and we can't talk about that. So there you go. Problem solved, right? But then you sort of realize, as Schulze did, is like, well, but you said that the understanding is spontaneous, right? You said that we apply the category spontaneously. And so you can't maintain that freedom is just something, he calls it problematical. And if you wanted to get into more detail on the antinomies, there's like a difference between different kinds of antinomies, and he says it's a dynamical one. And so if you're more interested in seeing how Kant tries to deal with the issue of human freedom, you would like stuff like that. But the basic structure of Kant's solution is to say that, well, we might have freedom, we might not, but we can't say because that concerns a thing in itself, and we can't have knowledge about that. But the entire Kantian picture from the understanding onward has assumed that and has relied on the fact that humans are spontaneous and spontaneously apply categories to given sensory data. And you can't get rid of this spontaneity because it's really crucial to Kant's account. If you were to try to get rid of the spontaneity and just be like, oh, well, Kant can be ambivalent about whether or not human freedom is real, there's nothing that could unify our sensory representation. So this is a huge problem too. And this is one of the huge problems that Kant actually basically admits. So originally, Kant was only planning on writing a first critique. There was no plan for a second and a third critique. It's only in response to skeptical problems about human freedom that Kant realizes, oh no, actually, I can't just rely on human freedom being problematic, which is to say, I can't just say, oh, there could be freedom or there could not be freedom. We can't ever know. But actually, for the entire first critique to work, there has to be human freedom. And so in the second critique, the critique of practical reason, Kant calls it the keystone to his entire critical enterprise, because only in the second critique do you get a proof that human freedom is not just problematical, you know, it could be, it could not be, but is actually real. And so, interestingly enough, a lot of continental philosophers are like really uninterested in Kant's practical philosophy. They're like, oh no, you know, categorical imperative, that's like really prudish stuff. Like, doesn't matter, doesn't apply to me, whatever. But it's only in the practical philosophy that you actually get an adequate account of human freedom, and that makes the entire theoretical philosophy work. And so all the post-Kantian German idealists are really, really obsessed with Kant's practical philosophy, not because they're strict moralists or because they're super interested in chastising people for every violation of the moral law or something like that. Some of them are. Fichte is very interested in chastising people. But sort of the main motivation for this comes from the fact that it's really key to the entire critical enterprise working. And so this is another instance where Kant seems caught up in an antinomy. On the one hand, he has to assert the merely problematical nature of human freedom, but on the other hand, the entire system of the critique of pure reason, even just the ability to assess our own reasoning capacity, already presumes that human freedom and awareness is something not just possible, but actually real. So that's another huge problem in the Kantian system. And so a third one A third sort of huge problem, and this will be helpful for you guys to think about. You guys just mentioned that you were like just finishing the deduction. So soon you'll get to this really, really weird chapter called the schematism. And this one will throw you through some loops, right? Okay, so here's a skeptical problem that Kant realizes, tries to deal with in the first critique. He says something like, okay, so the categories are rules for the unification of a sensory manifold. That's jargony, but it basically just means, okay, concepts have to apply to our sensations. But the problem is, how do we know which concepts apply to which sensations? Really hard problem, because your instinct is, oh, well, just give another concept, right? That's all you need. You just need another rule or something like that. But this leads to an infinite regress. It's like trying to count to pi backwards. Like, you can't do it. You don't know where to start. You don't know what rule determines an application of a rule, determines an application of a rule, determines an application of a rule ad nauseum. And so if you're into Wittgenstein, or if this is helpful, it's like the rule following paradox. You can't determine, you can't give a rule for when another rule is applied, because that just begs the question of yet another rule and yet another rule ad nauseum, and you never get started. And so, so here Kant has to come up with, okay, well, what's something that's not sensibility and not understanding that operates kind of between the two of them and can serve to unify them? And here's where Kant starts talking about the imagination.
Imagination.
Okay. And the imagination, Kant is a waffler. He will waffle back and forth endlessly. Sometimes he will describe it as a faculty of receptivity and sensibility, and sometimes he'll describe it as a faculty of spontaneity. And the reason why he waffles so much on this question is because it's not really coherent for the schematism to be either, or imagination to be either. So imagination is supposed to help us figure out when to apply rules. And so it can't itself be a rule, but it can't also be that receptive capacity, that receptive thing, because that doesn't tell us anything about how to apply rules either. And so he'll kind of say some like very quaint stuff about like, oh, when you get old and you become wise, you know when to apply rules, and you know, I've seen enough chairs, I know it's a chair, damn it. And like, fair enough, right? But this isn't anything like the form of a solution to this problem, right? And this points out even furthermore sort of a general problem that I kind of pointed out in the beginning, that Kant says there are faculties of receptivity, there are faculties of spontaneity, and he says, oh, well, maybe there's something unifying the two of them, but we could never know about it. How is it ever that a concept could apply to a sensation? It seems like, given that Kant wanted to say that they're radically heterogeneous, that you need some third thing to unify them. But that third thing doesn't really help you very much, because it doesn't have anything in common. It doesn't have the necessary link to both sensibility and the understanding. So this is another huge, huge problem. If you're, like I mentioned Heidegger and Heidegger's reading of Kant, Heidegger is super into this imagination stuff. Here Heidegger's like, oh, this is where basically Kant is an existentialist, and he has this insight about being and stuff like that and the imagination, but then he shirks away from it. He's like unable to heal for whatever reason. I don't really understand, but so a lot of different philosophers will sort of make hay of what is the imagination? What is the imagination doing? Because it's important to the whole architecture of what we've been talking about up to this point. And it seems like the real problem is that Kant hasn't offered anything like systematic unity between faculty of receptivity and faculty of and faculties relating to spontaneity, namely the understanding. So kind of all of the problems point to the fact that Kant doesn't have anything like a single overarching principle that guides the first critique. And what these skeptical problems point to, at least according to the German idealists after Kant, is that the lack of any systematic unifying principle for Kant's system has led him into the exact same problems of modern metaphysics. That he himself has all these pre-critical assumptions, and so all of the German idealists, in their own way, the post-Kantian German idealists, say, okay, Kantian system's really good. It solves a lot of our problems. That's great. But what we need to do is we need to systematically unify the Kantian system so that it's not just a faculty over here, a faculty over there, these crazy things themselves that we can't know anything about, but also we do know stuff about, and human freedom. And we need to give something like a systematic account of Kantian philosophy without these antinomies of the Kantian system itself. And this leads directly into Fichte and Fichte's project. So Fichte wants to say, and I'll be very, very brief here, since I know I've already strained patience, and there's another time where we can maybe talk more about Fichte and Schelling and Hegel. But the basic outlines of Fichte's project is, let's give a systematic account of Kantian transcendental idealism. Let's do it from a single point, and that point is human freedom. And so Fichte's account, as crazy as it can seem whenever you read it out of context, you know, you'll see him saying stuff like the I posits the not I and stuff like that. And whenever you first read that, at least my impression was, this person is insane. Like, they're saying that stuff that's outside of my head just comes from my head or something like that. But no, I mean, what Fichte is trying to do is be able to systematically explain, in his account, the not I is the thing in itself. So the thing in itself is just a posit that I have to make. And that's sort of maybe a very brief rudimentary understanding what he means by saying sort of crazy stuff, like the I posits the not I, is that he's immediately trying to respond to these problems with Kantian philosophy pointed out by people I mentioned, like Jacobi, Schulze, and Maimon. And so, in general, just to conclude, all of the German idealists are going to try to give a systematic account of human freedom that accounts especially for the unity. And this is their obsession with system. You know, I mean, to some extent, they're just into systems, you know, old modern Germans or whatever. But the more fundamental reason, besides aesthetic reasons for why they're into system, is just because I think finally this will solve all those problems that have plagued Kantian philosophy and all modern philosophy prior to Kantian philosophy. So finally, they're going to give a system of human freedom, which, by the way, is modeled on the French Revolution, which they all take as their sort of fundamental inspiration. Yeah, and so it's an eminently political project as well. And so, yeah. Do you guys have any final questions or anything like that?
was amazing. Thank you.
Thanks.
I've got a few questions, but I wanna like see if Tegan or Michael might have any, or anyone else in here.
I don't have any questions, but man, again, great stuff, and I told you wouldn't disappoint.
Thanks, man.
I have questions, but you'd be here for 3 or 4 more hours, so I think that we might want to do this again or something.
Yeah, I do agree with that. This, like I say, this feels like, you know, we at least need another chapter to this.
I think that there's plans for sort of a more Fichte Hegel-centered version at a later point. I'm glad that this is the response and not just like, oh God, can we please be done with all these Germans?
No, I mean, I tell you what, I think most of us who are interested in continental philosophy, we all are interested in learning what happened during, you know, what's the author who calls it the 25 years of philosophy?
Yeah,
I've got the book.
Yeah, I think that's Forster.
Yeah. And there's so much in this 25 years. And for me, even with as much as I've studied, it's just so intimidating. You need really 5 lifetimes just to focus on this 25 years to wrap your head around it. And no, I've always been really impressed with how much of it you've absorbed so quickly. And, you know, most of the time, you know, we've talked about it before. Everybody wants Kant and Hegel, but they want to skip Fichte and Schelling. And that's a mistake. And, you know, I would love to hear more about Fichte and Schelling. And, you know, again, I'm still mad at myself for ruining the other recording you did where you kind of covered this stuff before, and listening to the damn Weekend and YouTube cutting it off because of copyrights. But yeah, I'm definitely up for another lecture.
Okay.
Well, 10 words or less. Huh. Did Hegel think he resolved the issue of the thing in itself? Did he craftily resituate it? And yeah, and that's like a not a slam. There's no slam dunk answer there.
Yeah.
But
yeah. So very briefly, basically, Schelling and Hegel around the year 1800 together decide this is irresolvable as long as you remain within transcendental idealism. So as long as you make any appearance between, or a distinction between appearances and things themselves, you run into this problem. And so part of the sense of Hegel's absolute idealism is he's going to get rid of this transcendental restriction. And so this is why some people respond to Hegel as saying like, oh, you're like metaphysics gone wild. You know, like this is the wildest metaphysics. This is exactly what Kant didn't want. But Hegel at least sees himself as, no, I'm responding to the skeptical, irresolvable problems with the Kantian system. And so that's, so Hegel gets rid of the transcendental restriction, just goes full-blown absolute idealism. That doesn't mean that everything's in your head. It's more similar to sort of Plato or Aristotle, where there are just sort of ideal structures in the world. You don't need to say that they're just for a given subject or something like that. So that's briefly what he said, his response. And then he furthermore says, well, things in themselves, that's just an illusion. Kant says that you can think the things in themselves, but you can't know them. Hegel says the opposite. You can know them because you can't think them at all. There's nothing to think. You know everything you need to know. There you go. That's very typical of Hegel. It's just, you know, some reversal like that. That's take on the thing in itself.
I'm gonna risk sounding stupid like every time I talk, but especially right now because I really this is all really beyond me. And it might be because my confusion might come from the fact that you're having to oversimplify, or it might just come from my fundamental misunderstanding of Kant so far. But it just seems like the first and second antinomies that you were talking about didn't really seem so like if I was Kant and someone told me those things, I'd be like, so what? I mean, I already told you that the thing in itself is essentially an irreducible, unanswerable, right? But it's there. And it's because it's irreducible and unanswerable, but we know it's there, that he's able to kind of couch things on it. And his project is very humble about the fact that we know that we have to couch parts of this structure on stuff that we can't even talk about. But it seems like he's self-aware of that, and so where would they get off being able to, respond with those antinomies?
Yeah. So I think that you're definitely capturing the spirit of what Kant would say. It's more or less like, so what? Here's maybe the skeptical response why it's a problem for Kant to give that kind of answer. So on the one hand, I guess maybe there are two different species of a Kantian response. One Kantian response is there's no contradiction. So I haven't contradicted myself, and you're wrong whenever you impute this contradiction in me. And so here I think the skeptic would say, well, when you say stuff about things themselves causing our representations, and you say causality can only apply to appearances, that seems like there is plainly a contradiction in the account. And so, but you might also say then secondly, actually there's a contradiction, and that's just fine because that's just what it is to think about things in themselves, which I think is maybe a more tenable response for a Kant or for a Kantian to make. And this seems to be the spirit of what a lot of Kant is doing. But if you're just willing to accept a contradiction like that, then you haven't really refuted the skeptic as well as you thought you did, right? Because the skeptic is going to say, well, okay, then you haven't given me a better account than a direct realist account if you're just going to say, well, I contradicted myself, but it's okay because it's about these class of things that can contradict themselves. Because the empiricist is going to say the same things about appearances. Namely, appearances are just regularities, man. Why are you so worked up about getting objective causal laws whenever we can just have and deal with regularities? And that seems to be what scientists do. Some people argue. And so, that's enough. That's all you need. And so I think that would be the general thrust of what a skeptic or what a post-Kantian German idealist would say in response. It's like either you're not really dealing with the fact that you're not recognizing that there's a contradiction, or you do recognize there's a contradiction, but then your account's not any better than Hume's or whoever, or Barclay's or whoever else. There's no reason for why we have to save appearances and not things in themselves.
Hey Tyler, tell me what you think about this, because at this moment of this contradiction concerning causality, I also see a second one involved in it, and I don't know if any of the skeptics or the critics of Kant pointed this out, but as far as I understand it, if things in themselves have this role of causing our experiences, or at least in part causing our experience, if you go into it, you'd have to say, well, the reason they cause, the causal dimension of this involves the giving of sensations, because what the transcendental apparatus, both understanding and concepts, what they work on are the raw sense data or the manifold. And so the manifold as I understand it, is the giving of things in themselves. But if things in themselves have accidents or qualities to give, then it presupposes that they're substances. So you're back in the substance accident category. So not only is there causality in this contradiction, there's also substance accident if we view it in those terms.
I think that's totally right. I think it's totally right because, like, as soon as you apply any of the categories to things in themselves, then it seems like presumably you have to start applying all of them.
Right.
To make those categories in order to make it coherent as an object for you to talk about. And I think that this is like a really nice demonstration of how you slide into talking about substance and accident, and now you're not in any better spot than Spinoza is.
No, and think about it. If we're talking about, if we're back into the category of substance and accident, then we have to go, well, if there's multiple substances, things, plural, then are we to say that these things don't have spatial relations or temporal relations, given the fact that we are attributing unity, plurality, and totality? We could bring in those categories as well, because if there's multiple substances, then here come the other categories. And so, yeah, it seems that this issue or this contradiction concerning causality is really kind of like a vacuum that sucks all the other categories in as well. And if that's the case, then it does seem that this line between things in them, noumena and phenomena, collapses. And if that's the case, then the whole Kantian project seems to collapse.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think this is like the general spirit of Hegel's response. Well, one of Hegel's responses to Kant, this stuff about limits. Hegel tends to respond to anyone that says that there's any sort of fundamental limitation on our knowledge. He wants to say two things, and it's sort of a dialectical convergence of opposites. It's both feeble-minded and narcissistic. Because you're saying that there's this fundamental limit to human knowledge and we can't do anything about it on the one hand. You're not offering anything like an adequate explanation. And then it's narcissistic on the other, because not only do you claim to posit a limit to our understanding, but then you claim to know what's on the other side of that limit too. And so you pass the limit at the very same time that you articulate it. And so I think that I think you're totally right that, like, as soon as, and I agree with Hegel, just that, like, as soon as you start talking about fundamental limitations to knowledge, you find yourself, as soon as you're talking about this, you be helping yourself to all these categories that you just previously said you can't use. And I think that you can even see this, obviously Kant is going to be more consistent than your average person. But I think anytime you hear someone saying something like, oh, but humans can't really know that, or, it's not up for us to decide, or, these are categories just for us, or something like that, there's always the implication that there's some understanding of what some other categories would look like outside of the ones that we have that would adequately correspond to the thing itself. And they're already helping themselves to the very thing that they said they can't have. Which is just a long way of saying I think that you're right, and that your response is maybe a more detailed version of something that I think is general thrust of what Hegel would say in response to Kant.
Yeah, I've been developing this as I've been working on my Deleuzian-inspired critique of Kant, and a lot of what I've seen to be some of the problems with Kant come out of Deleuze, and the thing with substance and accident and the rest of it kind of comes from that.
Yeah, I think Deleuze's reading of Kant is really interesting because he's like one of the only people that takes really seriously faculties and their relationship. And Kant seems to take this stuff very seriously, but Kantians, especially contemporary Kantians, really want to downplay the importance of that stuff, so that they're not amenable to the fact, well, we don't like categories don't work this way. Like I talk about neural networks, that doesn't look like receptivity and understanding or something like that.
Yeah, but you almost want to go, well, is this maybe like a Lyothardian differend where they're not giving the Kantian discourse its own space to live and breathe, where they're essentially just trying to say, oh, well, that doesn't fit into our discourse, so your discourse is discredited.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's basically what's happening.
Yeah.
And yeah. Yeah, I think it's true.
You know, just so a reminder, where's that great quote where Hegel talks about the limit? Isn't it in the preface of Phenomenology?
He talks in the introduction of the Phenomenology about how it's incoherent to posit limits to truth and knowledge.
Okay, yeah, I thought it was in preface or introduction.
Yeah, I'm sure he talks about it in some way in the preface too, because the preface seems to talk about everything. But yeah, it occurs sort of all over. I'm like in the middle of the science of logic right now, and like in almost every remark or whatever, he's sort of repeating this general line.
Well, we have just a few minutes left here. I really appreciate this talk, and it's gonna give me a lot of. I don't know. I feel like some of it was stuff that I thought I already knew, but I wasn't quite sure. So I got some validation out of this, you know, as far as the critique of Peruzzi goes. But you know, it was also comforting to know that deduction section is like one of the hardest out there, and that you know, and that some of this is downhill from there, and that it's going to be kind of like this survey of him applying the system to all these other questions. That was all really cool. Now I have something to look forward to. I'm kind of curious though, like, so, well, there's a few ways of asking this question. Yeah, I guess I'd rather make it more personal than abstract. What is your relationship to Kant? And I guess we can even get more general philosophy, right? You've kind of honed in on German philosophy. I love to ask people this question: what got you into philosophy? And kind of what role, Kant plays in all of that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I want to make sure before I forget to assure you, yes, it is all basically downhill after the Transcendental Deduction. Maybe not only like that book, but maybe like just everything else is downhill. So that's good news. But as far as my own relationship to Kant, so I mean, yeah, I'm trying to think about how specifically I want to answer this. I mean, I could say something about like, oh, I do work in Fichte and Hegel and Kant's important for that, or blah, 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 but that seems kind of boring. I think that maybe the more fundamental answer is the reason why I'm really interested in Kant, because I'm a communist, and I think that universality is really important to communism. And I think that, I mean, even if you weren't a communist, I think that you should hope for something that is genuinely emancipatory, not just for you, not just for some other group, but genuinely for everyone. And I think that Kant is sort of really the first thinker to wonder about this kind of universality and what potentially could be the basis for it, and what would it mean to live in a society where one person's freedom means live in a society where one person's freedom is consistent with the freedom of everyone. I think that's genuinely moving. I think that's genuinely important for contemporary emancipatory struggles. So thinking about that, and thinking about that especially in relationship to human freedom, is really important to me. And so that's maybe more practical philosophy, Kant. But I think a practical philosophy Kant and a theoretical philosophy Kant, they're both Kant. And so they're importantly related for especially the reason I outlined about human freedom, that the whole first critique already kind of assumes the apparatus of human freedom, and Kant comes to realize this at a later point. I think that also makes my reading in generally German idealist readings different from a lot of continental readings after the German idealist period, because generally they'll be interested in the first critique, but they'll think that more or less everything that Kant did as far as practical philosophy is prudish garbage. And obviously there's some of that. There's no denying Kant can be a real prude and that he can be a real racist, and he thinks like masturbation is like worse than suicide, which is like very so there's a lot of weird
That's
stuff.
one of my favorites.
Yeah.
I'll find the quote. I'll share it over in the site.
Yeah, but there's a lot worth keeping too. So I'd say that's sort of why I'm interested in Kant.
That was a way more interesting answer than the other one. Because it's relevant to Schelling. But I'm assuming that's why German idealists are interesting in general, right? Because they're trying to get at this sort of universal subjectivity.
Yeah.
Like what is the thing that can hold us all together, and like how? Yeah. Well, that's one of the problems with skepticism, right? And it seems like a lot of almost every libertarian I know is a sort of skeptic, right? Like, or like a sort of solipsist. Like they're all Cartesian, it seems like.
Yeah.
So we're trying to get past that, it seems like. Right.
I mean, I think that like one way to read the whole German idealist tradition is like, Kant wrote prior to the French Revolution, but also wrote somewhat after the French Revolution. But all the other post-Kantian German idealists are all responding to the French Revolution, and they all want to, they want to put system and freedom together, which is to say, they want freedom, but they don't want individual freedom. They want everyone's freedom to be able to potentially cohere with one another. That's maybe one more sympathetic way of putting sort of the unity of system and freedom. It's not some fetishistic thing that some 19th century Germans were into because they had a lot of time on their hands or something like that. But they wanted to try to figure out how everyone's freedom could work together and what they could learn about what they could learn from the French Revolution about how to do that. So yeah, that's what I would say probably.
Sweet. Anybody have any other questions before we wrap up?
Can I just say that I always love pointing out to libertarians that my fundamental issue with them is bad ontology.
Oh yeah.
They just the look on their face, or when I say it on social media, of course it's the smug intellectual asshole using words that nobody understands. Yeah, okay. No, it's bad ontology, fuckers. Sorry.
Cool, man. Well, if you're not able to join us for anything else before then, we'll have plenty of stuff coming up here. We look forward to joining you again on April 16th.
Yeah, cool. I look forward to it. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, guys. Really had a great time.
Yes. Take care.
Have a good night.
So